Michael with United Veterans Worldwide, here for an exciting interview today with Brandon. I found him on Instagram. We connected, we had a chat, and I was really impressed with what he's doing right now to further the work of veterans' causes in the area which he's in California. And so, Brandon, thanks for being on our channel today and being vulnerable enough to be on screen and share your message with what today is 11,500 subscribers globally. Brandon, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, and then we'll get into the interview.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today. My name is BrandonCarn. I'm a graphic designer, mural painter, arts educator. I call myself a STEAM educator because I see the importance of all the letters.
Yeah.
And I've been involved in a lot of different causes and now getting to work with veterans over the last couple of years, and here to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, that is awesome. And you're originally from Southern California, or?
Yeah, I'm born and raised in Southern California.
And I think when we chatted, you mentioned that you didn't serve, but you have a quite the long history of military in your family.
I do. I'm not a veteran. A lot of people think that I am, though, because I have a shaved head. So, like, I've had situations where I go to like a potluck or something, and they're like, "Oh, I had one veteran who he served in Iraq, and he was an engineer. He was talking about the history of one of the army camps near us, and he thought I was an army veteran because my head was shaved, and so did his brother." I'm like, "No, I've never served. I didn't want to get in." And I went down the university college route. That's the one I picked.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of ancestry with military. I have a number of relatives that served in the Second World War. So I have a great grandfather that was in Germany during the war and just after. He was in the Army Air Corps, which then later became the Air Force. And then he died in the 60s. My great grandparents were originally from Ohio, Central Ohio. The reason they moved to California was just about the end of the Second World War because they found work here. One of them worked at the mess hall of an Army camp here. It was called Camp Hahn. And then another one assembled aircraft at Marchfield. People know it more as March Air Force Base now, March Air Reserve Base. And a few other cousins, like second cousins that served in Vietnam. I remember my mother telling me, my mother grew up in the community that I'm from, and she remembers the Vietnam War pretty particularly well. Like, she remembers airplanes flying over, probably B-52s flying over to Vietnam. We actually just lost this last few days an older gentleman. He just died of brain cancer, and his name was Pete, and he was well known around the community. He had memories of the Korean War, and he not too long ago he was talking about the D-Day anniversary, I think the 80th anniversary.
Wow!
And he just passed away a few days ago. I found out.
Oh wow!
They have a similar military history here, so we are losing people still. I've grown up with, and going back to the modern period, I was born right after the Soviet Union fell, Gulf War. So I have some memories. I'm like, what's the Soviet Union? What's this Cold War you're talking about? We grew up in that and no memories of it. Remember 9/11 pretty well. And that pretty much shaped, I think, our generation, the millennial generation, pretty well. Generation Z too. My military history, I've known a lot of people in school that went to serve in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. One cousin was a Marine. He was active for 4 years. He was in Afghanistan, Syria, fighting ISIS. That cousin actually got to see the Moab dropped. President Trump dropped the Moab in Afghanistan to blow up that cave of ISIS members. I forget which province or district it was in, but he was there to see it happen.
Oh, wow.
Those are the stories I remember. I have another older cousin. He served in Iraq. He was in the Air Force, but he was borrowed by the military, and he did a lot of security at bases in Iraq, like Erbil Air Force Base. I remember him telling us the story about Saddam Hussein's village, the Flintstones village he had made out of rocks for kids, his grandchildren and stuff. They used to go in and out of there and be headquartered out of there. So he has a lot of stories. He served in Hurricane Katrina. In the aftermath of that, drove Beyonce to a concert in Louisiana by himself once. And a lot of other people. His wife served in Bell. She was in Iraq and South Korea. I had a number of people from school that I know. I remember the Iraq War pretty well when I was in high school, and Afghanistan. I had some people might know the name of I think Private Marcus Tynes was his rank when he died. He was a classmate of mine since I was in middle school. We graduated a year apart, and I was a freshman in college. He was killed in Kandahar by a Taliban IED. So he was killed there. Was a little bit of one of the reasons I decided I didn't really want to enlist, because I just thought it was too risky.
Yeah.
And he's pretty well memorialized in our city. He's actually buried pretty close to one of the fallen 13 from the patrol from Afghanistan, believe it or not. That's actually kind of like got a little bit involved in it. And others went to school with a lot of veterans from Iraq, Afghanistan, college, worked with a few, and volunteer. I have a really good friend named Angel, who helped get an interpreter out of Afghanistan. He's an Army vet, served in Afghanistan about 16 years ago, and he still has injuries from it. But he's still persevering, and he's making it. So, and I grew up in an Air Force community. March Air Force Base, I remember growing up with. I remember downsizing, and now we have National Guard around us. The Marines come through here from Camp Pendleton to 29 Palms. It was actually kind of funny because my cousin that was Marine, they would make him lead the convoys because he was from the area. And so people would see him on the bridge, and they would hold up flags and stuff. And they're like, oh, his nickname in the Marines was Les. I don't know why, but they called him Les.
Yeah.
And he would drive. They briefed him, and then they made him do a convoy through our community on the way, because he's only one of the few from the region. So I thought that was funny. And the Marines are really handy. Like, they would break down in other communities on the way, and people drive out and bring them tools and stuff. They always knew what to do. Yeah. Always had a cell phone handy. So, and a few things. I've been active a little bit as a volunteer. I've volunteered a number of times at Camp Pendleton. Operation Help a Hero was my favorite pick. I thought about the USO, but I'm in the middle of relocating a little bit, so I haven't decided on a location. And then painting now veterans. So I've done a utility box mural of Victor Glover, who's an astronaut that's going to be one of the first astronauts to go back to the moon in September 2025. And he's from a nearby community, Ontario, California. So that's pretty cool. Yeah. So I painted him first, and then I did a general veterans mural about the global war on terror. And I'm still working on other ones and planning other ones. So.
Well, it's amazing the ties that you have to the military and to veterans in general. I would love to contact some of those people you've mentioned who have served and maybe hear some of their stories firsthand on here as well. But I really want to get to what your skill set is currently with art, what you're doing in school, and how it translates into now benefiting veterans.
Well, I do it a number of different ways. I think one of the most impactful things I've been doing right now is just painting the murals in general. Well, we really didn't grow up with much public art or street art. Like, communities around us did. When I was a kid, we would go to Las Vegas a lot, and one of the communities on the way there is Barstow, which is not far from Fort Irwin, and also where the logistics depot is for the Marines.
And the National Training Center, which is where all of us trained up in the sand there before we deployed over in the Middle East. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And we would see that. I'm like, how come we can't have that in our town? And it's like, we've never had much drive. And I remember about 8 years ago, I was still in grad school because I'm a teacher, so I got licensed. And I'm like, they were doing open calls for artists on some of the buildings that used to belong to March Air Force Base, but they never actually painted anything on them. I'm like, that's a shame. Why not? I would have done it, but they never pursued it. And so I always kind of got interested. I'm like, how come we're not doing more to keep those buildings going? Because most of the buildings there are now been demolished. They used to exist during the Cold War. But you got some of these buildings that are going back to like the 50s, the 60s, and they're filled with asbestos, and they've destroyed a lot. And March is actually one of the few surviving Air Force bases in our region. We used to have Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino, and then there was George Air Force Base, and they were both shut down. And San Bernardino's airport's kind of used for civilian use, but it took by 30 years before you got much in there. And then George Air Force Base is it's a logistics airport, but it's pretty much abandoned still. So it's like, it was pretty sad to see a lot of these old urban spaces kind of decay. And then when I was growing up in the 90s, I always heard about like, how the loss of this Air Force Base or that Air Force Base caused like a huge economic downturn.
It does.
Where I grew up, we have tons of military. It really hit San Bernardino particularly hard. And I went to college in San Bernardino, and I drive through there periodically. I was just there this last weekend to see some of the new murals there. And you just see like the catastrophic impact the loss of the Air Force Base had. And it's been 30 years since Norton closed.
Yeah.
So I think just being aware of that there was a need for art in different capacities was always present growing up in my life. We always kind of wondered, well, we have so much history with this space. March has been around since World War I, and it's been active, is still active today. And we really kind of forgot that it existed. I mean, a lot of people don't even know the Army was here during World War II.
True.
A lot of people just don't know. And it's like, there was always kind of an interest in me to like, well, we need to teach our community history. And it was kind of weird for me growing up where I am from, because it's like most people, I'd say 90% of people are not from the community, the region we're from. They came from LA or they came from somewhere else. They don't know anything about it. And I had this strange identity or background that I'm the descendant of people that came here during the Cold War. My grandmother is German, so she moved here in the late 50s, married into someone that was in a military community. And she had the Air Force here had a huge impact on like our family identity and our history and why we're even in California and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And her stepfather was an American and he was in the Air Force, which is why she came to the United States. And it's like, I was always aware of like all of these specific things that went back like 50, 60 years long before I was born. But then I would grow up in the school system here and I'd grow up in the community. Like no one knew anything about military history here. They didn't know anything about the general history here.
Yeah.
And I would go to other places and I'm like, how come they have like more going on? And we'd have like no identity here. It's like, we might as well live in the middle of the desert, nowhere in the middle of a desert island or something. It was so weird. And I've tried working in the last several years to change that and make that different because I knew it should be different.
And you're in the San Diego area, is that right, Brandon?
I'm north of San Diego. I'm about 100 miles north of San Diego.
Okay.
I'm a little bit closer to LA.
Okay.
About 60 miles to LA.
Yeah, it's interesting. San Diego has a rich history. If I think back to like what they called the Mormon Battalion, who went on one of the largest infantry marches all the way down to Southern California to be ready to fight the Mexican army, and ended up not fighting at all and ended up walking back all that distance too. So I know there's some historical markers down in San Diego for that as well.
There are, and actually I have my father's ancestors were in that battalion.
No kidding.
So I grew up a little bit with that as well. Like the Mormon Trail from Utah comes through the region, and my father used to point out like strange landmarks and stuff to us. Like, here's a logging trail the Mormons used and a park in San Bernardino. I didn't know what in the world he was talking about at the time.
Yeah.
I'm like, what? We're going to Big Bear. We're going to the lake. Why are we stopping in the middle of the road looking at this stuff? I'm like,
yeah. I
always thought it was weird. I didn't learn too much later that I actually did. Because the Mormons, actually, I'm not Mormon, but they have a pretty well documented history. And it's like extremely clear. I'm like, wow, I didn't know I had people fought in the Mexican-American War.
That is
and
wild.
As well. Yeah.
Yeah, that is wild.
And actually, my mother and my father's ancestors both fought in the Mexican-American War. So they were both in the same general region, the same time. And so I'm like, oh, I have more Civil War. I have Civil War ancestry too. I found out just in the last couple of years, my own pursuits, I found out I had a couple relatives, great uncles that served in like 2nd Manassas and 1 battalion in Gettysburg. One was a medical doctor. One lost his life fighting Stonewall Jackson at 2nd Manassas. And I found out he actually had a sword at Manassas Military Park, and I went to Washington, D.C., and actually got to see it at the visitor center. I'm like, I cannot. Somebody somewhere else out there on the bloodline gave it to them like decades ago, and I've never even had a clue.
Wow.
I had Civil War too.
I'm surprised you didn't go into like military history in your with all of this wealth of knowledge that you've started to gain. You'd be an excellent historian.
Well, I have a certification in social studies. I mean, I taught social studies for 1 year in middle school. It was American history, and I got to tie into it a little bit, but I didn't know any of that ancestry until a couple of years after. Just going to ancestry.com, and I'm like, I can't believe there's people from the Civil War in my background.
Yes.
There were, and a lot of it I kind of like picked up on and got into. I'm like, I can't believe I'm related to a doctor that used to amputate people and do first aid at Gettysburg and Fredericksburg. I guess he was actually given a job by Abraham Lincoln to oversee the hospitals in the District of Columbia. It's like, when I was younger, it drove a curiosity. I'm like, do I have people like that in my background? And I started looking for years. And it wasn't until I was much older that I found out, yeah, I have a few. There are some people out there that you're related to, but mostly American. And I kind of call myself a product of both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny.
So now you're involved in these murals. So why get involved? Why paint murals, especially for these military folks?
I think because a lot of different things happened over the years. We're a pretty big veteran community where I grew up, and you really kind of see a number of different factors going on. Like there's a huge epidemic of homelessness in California. It just seems like no one at any level is handling the problem responsibly or effectively, no matter what approach they take. And the economy and the cost of living here is a huge factor, and especially as for veterans, the homeless as well. It's just like you have a lot of, when I was a teacher, I taught middle school. I had a number of students that were the children of either active duty Air Force, or they were just out of the military, and I would learn about their background from meeting the parents. And so I was aware that there was a pretty large military community still active, even in the last, say, 5 or 10 years. So I was aware of a lot of things going on already. And we honor a lot of them. Like Marcus Tynes has his name. We have a large veterans monument here in town, and it was mentioned. His name was put on it. So I kind of always was aware of it in the background and going on. There was always things going on with the global war on terror. It's like, it seems like it was kind of sad. It's like my students didn't know like what peace was like. Because I remember 9/11 and before 9/11, when like we were not at war, the United States was not at war. It's like, it was so sad that these kids did not know kind of what that was like.
Yeah.
And so the things like that were always in the back of my mind. So I always wanted to do murals. I always thought there was an interest, but it seemed like no one was really pursuing them. I'm like, no one really cares about it out here. So there was never an avenue to do it. And then in early 2023, that started to change. Like I'm a trained art teacher, and I have experience like that. And I'm like, okay, I know how to paint. I know how to do acrylic. I always kind of wanted to do something like a masonry board or a project like that with students and kind of present it. And there was no real avenue. But we had a new mayor elected in 2022, and there have been a lot of people locally that have been talking about kind of getting more into a public art program for the first time. And he was probably one of the first people I had ever seen push it. And okay, like they had done 1 or 2 murals where I went to college. There's a hospital out here as a small mural. I was always fascinated by the idea, but we never had the opportunity, but there was funding for it. So, okay, so we had a couple sessions in our community to kind of talk about the idea and the pursuit. I ended up meeting a lot of local painters in our community. Some of them, not so much active in our city. They are now, but nearby in Riverside. So we're in Riverside County here.
Yeah.
And we had done a lot of artwork in downtown Riverside. And downtown Riverside has a lot of iconic landmarks in Southern California, the Mission Inn. I also used to give guided tours at the Mission Inn.
And that's close to Pendleton, right?
Kind of. We're about an hour and 15 minutes north. I think probably about 50 miles north of Oceanside.
Okay.
And Kameni area, Pendleton is. But when I was a docent at that museum, I learned a lot about the war history I had never learned about before. We have a 10-month, back then they had a 10-month training program. You would give guided tours. And I found out that hotel was just like swamped with GIs during World War II. I couldn't believe that. And the owner of the hotel, his name was Frank Miller. He was a peace advocate. One of the reasons he was a peace advocate was because he had seen people die in the Civil War, and that he immigrated from Wisconsin to California. His dad was a civil surveyor, and actually had planted a lot of the crops and the first canals and stuff in our area. And it really fascinated me. And he also knew a lot of people that died during World War I that worked for the hotel, that were in the community, and he was a huge peace advocate. And it was just fascinating about this. I think this is not history I had ever learned in school. I'm like, how come and I think this is one of the bigger drivers for me. I was like, why are people in other communities and museums learning about history that we have just as equal a tie to through this space and through our community? We never hear about it.
Yeah.
I'm like, if I had not been a docent and volunteered there, I'd never have known any of this was true.
Yeah.
And then I find out Frank Miller there's a lot of ties between this hotel and the founding of March Field. I mean, you have architects that did some of the first permanent buildings there that they shared. Frank Miller was a big advocate in building airports and bringing flight to California and to the region. Now, some of it obviously was to boost his hotel and stuff. He wanted to make some money, but he wanted to have air shows here. And because he lobbied the Army Air Corps to bring that base here, that's why it's here. And for over 100 years, it's been here. And that's why I exist. And that's why I have a military background. That's why I'm in California, because someone that built this hotel.
Yeah.
And I didn't know any of this until I took this volunteering program. And it's kind of sad because I think the museum has closed and they're not doing the same tours they used to. So that's actually over now. But it's just, I couldn't believe that was going on. And while I worked at the hotel, I met a lot of artists there too. There was an artist, she's still active there. Her name was Tiffany Brooks. I remember she was painting the spa, the entryway to the spa in the hotel. And it's just fascinating. I'm like, I always used to wonder, how come we don't have people like this in the community I grew up in? How come we're not doing stuff to restore these old buildings and make at least some history?
Yeah.
And it just always advocated for me. It was just frustrating growing up and seeing most other communities try to do something and we just didn't even know what's going on.
Yeah.
And so that kind of went with it. And then seeing a lot of the ramifications from the global war on terror. Like, I was aware of a lot of mental health problems going around. I had seen people in school that had PTSD. I'd seen people that were depressed. But going back to 2023, the mayor's like, well, we can do an art program here. We've had funding for 10 years to try to do it. So a lot of us started getting together and talking about doing one. And there's a wonderful artist out here. I don't talk to her anymore, but her name is Rosie Cortez. She was one of the people that did a lot of the murals in the Riverside area. And she has some wonderful pieces there that talk about different diverse history in Riverside. And she had some workshops and meetings at the gallery they had there. And I was just like, I can do this too. It's just fascinating.
Yeah.
And it was just so awesome to see people take an initiative in their community and try to make it different and give back. And they're talking about people I'd never heard of, like Ishmael Villegas, I guess is a big name in Riverside. He was a soldier from Riverside that died in the U.S. presence in the Philippines. I'd never heard of him. I'd grown up around the National Cemetery here, Riverside National Cemetery and stuff, but I didn't know much about it. But studying local history, I found out, like, oh, this is an Army camp too. And it was a golf course, and Bob Hope used to go there and stuff. And so you learn a lot of stuff just by meeting people and interacting with them over time. So we started volunteering on a number of murals with her. She had gotten hired to do one at the community college here, and it was a big one about plants and nature. So I was an art teacher myself. I was teaching high school at the time, but far away. And I just started learning this new medium and how it brought people together, and the technology they were using was just absolutely fascinating. I'm like, I can do this. And at the same time, the high school I was working at was actually commissioning a lot of murals. We'd get them over our breaks and stuff. And that high school is actually, it's kind of funny because the Marines were out there a lot. That area it was in is the flight path to the Chocolate Mountains, where a lot of the Marines go out and train for desert warfare and stuff. And I'm like, you see C-130s flying over every day. You would see B-2 Osprey.
I jumped out of a lot of those.
Yeah, I've been in a few now as their static displays at like Fleet Week and stuff in LA.
Yeah.
We have air shows here. And I'm like, I can't believe the military traffic that just comes through, particularly the Marines. We'd have Marines come on campus and like be recruiters and stuff. You meet a few of them. And so it just kind of reminded me of like the heavy presence we have for them. And I'd commute home, I'd see a helicopter. I'm like, I can't believe that's out here right now. It's like you'd see all this traffic from usually either Miramar or Camp Pendleton.
Yep.
Like, it's pretty crazy. And it was always fascinating. I'd always see the Marines coming through growing up. And then we got more military with like our Earthquake Readiness Center stuff for the National Guard. So they were always in the back of my mind. And then as we were painting, the Air Force Reserve here is pretty active during the week. We started doing events, and when we had a local VFW here, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and I was thinking as early as March 2023, I'm like, that would be a great canvas wall. That would be a wonderful place to approach and do a mural on and paint eventually. So maybe after we do the community college one, I was thinking maybe as a group of people, we could do that one and tackle it.
Oh, that's amazing.
We ended up finishing that. And we have vets at that community college too. I mean, you have a ROTC there, you have the Veterans Center. So they would come by and kind of comment on it, talk about it. So as we were working, there's a lot of air traffic. Like you see C-130s flying over, you see C-17s, obviously, F-16s once in a while. They're just training, doing their weekly routine. And it really got me thinking, how come we don't have a mural for our active duty military here, or our veterans here? And I really think about it, and I pause. They're really, in our region, there weren't too many military-related murals. There's some in 29 Palms, Joshua Tree, which is near the Marine base. They had a few. The beach communities like Oceanside have a few, but they're mainly like the Iraq War, the Gulf War. I'm like, these are really old pieces. And as I was working, I would get knowledge of other ones. I would find out. I became friends with a lot of the mural painters too as I was working, just kind of networking. I met the individual. His name is Sergio Rueda. He did a piece in Lake Elsinore, which is on the Ortega Highway, which was right to Camp Pendleton. He is a veteran's theme one he did. It's more known for the Kobe Bryant one, but it's all in one building. That attracts people. Flat Hat Supply Company in Palm Desert, which is near Corporal Hunter Lopez, one of those who perished in the Afghanistan withdrawal grip. He had a really cool mural commission. His mother, I guess, went and commissioned a mural about 2 years ago. And I always wanted to see where it was. And as I was talking to veterans and painting with people, you kind of learn about like murals that are done in LA, San Diego, at different American Legions, the VFW. We have an American Legion here. And I think one of the first murals that got my attention was I did an American flag mural on the American Legion there, 2016. I think that was a little bit of a driving factor, but we had a couple others. And all these things just got me percolating. How come we don't have more of this type of stuff in the region? And just like we have World War II, we have all kinds of stuff. Like, why are we forgetting that it existed?
Yeah.
And it's really our youth don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And
Brandon, I've got a question for you. You mentioned something at the very beginning of the interview today. You mentioned the Fallen 13. For the audience who may not know what that means, will you explain that?
The Fallen 13 are the 13 Americans, mostly Marines, that gave their lives in the withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. And they kind of factored into painting as well. We had a veterans community. I got to know a number of them, the families, over time. I still talk to some of them and some of the veterans of the event. So 2021, I actually taught high school not too far from where Kareem Nakui grew up. He's one of the Marines from Norco, California, that perished in the attack. And the really weird thing is, Marcus Tynes is a classmate of mine, and he is buried in the exact same cemetery. He was buried there in 2010. And we were kind of going back and forth during the pandemic. We were teaching virtually. And you're kind of seeing, like, I know it's kind of in a disheveled order, but it's like you're kind of seeing like where things are coming into place. During the pandemic, my students were kind of having a hard time learning virtually academically, but you're seeing a lot of social, mental health problems, suicidal tendencies, huge anxiety problems, depression, chronic absenteeism, which we still haven't recovered from. And it's affected like our funding in California and the schools and stuff. And I'm just like, it was my first year working with high school, because I'd only worked with elementary and middle at that point. And it really started getting me aware that there's some serious health issues going on, mental health issues and other things that are happening in that. And it was not only true for students, but I'm sure this was true for military as well. And it's just what was going on.
Right.
And then, so I kind of developed this awareness of like an empathy, I suppose, or more active awareness. And I was teaching, and I would have things like I'd be observed and stuff for my evaluations. And I had people come to me and say, like, we don't know what's going on, but something about you, your teaching style, your personality, like they would say I was approachable. The students were not showing up to like their general subjects like English, math, Spanish, history, whatever. Like 15 kids out of 35 kids would show up. They were telling me, we don't know what's going on in your room, but all 35 are showing up for you every period, every time. It was so strange. And then I would have staff meetings with other teachers in our department, like music teachers, theater. Kids were depressed, weren't showing up. They weren't even like recording music or doing anything. Like, what am I doing right that is like causing a difference? It was really weird. And it kind of caused me to have an awareness of that. So eventually I left that high school.
Was it the art that was the generating factor for the therapy piece for them, or?
I think so. Something about like being able to express themselves and have an outlet. Some of them were saying things like, "You're the only teacher of all 6 classes that talks to us," and stuff. It was kind of sad.
Oh, wow.
Because a lot of them were stuck at home, especially with like brothers and sisters in the room, kind of driving each other crazy.
Yeah.
And that was a huge factor in it. Like, it is strange. And you would have like, we'd have things like art contests in the area, and you would see like kids like drawing themselves in like a black hole and an abyss. Like, you could tell there's some serious depression going around.
Right.
And it really reminded me of the veteran community too, because I'm like, that's a lot of science stuff I see in PTSD too, like the way the art is done.
Yep.
So over time, all of this kind of started coming together, and eventually I left that school in 2021, ended up trying to look for another job, and I went on a road trip across the United States, and I got to see a lot of places I'd never been to before for the first time. I'd never been to the World Trade Center. I got to see the 9/11 Memorial for the first time. I got to see the Freedom Tower for the first time, the Statue of Liberty. And I was really fascinated by like how people like a lot of Civil War battlefields actually too. I was really fascinated by like how people memorialize people visually. Like you'd have veterans of the Civil War be like a tower somewhere to some commander or captain that died in Gettysburg or Fredericksburg. I'm like, it was just fascinating. You'd see a lot of murals in different cities and places. New York had a lot of them. And it's really fascinating to see how people would depict that and capture it. And I'm like, as I was going through, I was visiting places like Norfolk, Virginia, and I'm like, and different places. I'm like, one of the things I think I decided on that trip was I want to remember and give back to the veteran community if I can. I want to volunteer. I want to be more of an advocate for their mental health. I had a few friends that went into like art therapy and stuff. I didn't pursue that. I'm like, it's something I feel like I can do for the community, at least the youth of service people. I always thought that was interesting as a career. And so as I'm traveling the country, there's also echoes in the background. Like I'd stop at a hotel, I'd turn on the radio in the car, and I'm hearing about the U.S. is leaving Afghanistan. The Taliban is taking districts back at lightning speed. I remember thinking, I really hope people are like paying attention to what's going on more. It really seemed like it was just getting out of control really quickly. And I figured at that point the Taliban would retake parts of the country. Maybe we'd partition it. Because I remember when I was in high school, the Darfur conflict, and then Sudan broken into 2 different countries because of the ethnic strife. But that's what I thought Afghanistan was going to be. And I was traveling, and it just seemed like it was getting more and more out of hand. We evacuated the embassy. Like, it's kind of weird being at places where the war started on 9/11, and then I'm like, you're hearing how the war is now ending. I went by the White House. Biden was in residency one day, and I was there. It was just like, looking back, it's kind of eerie. And so I'm like, okay. Eventually, I come home in August, and then that's really when the heart of the withdrawal is starting to take place. I wasn't working yet at the time, and it was just like, I can't believe. A lot of depression still from the pandemic, because I was traveling the country and people were like, you will wear a mask here or you will not wear a mask here. And it's like, you can stay at this hotel or not stay at this hotel. It was by the Canadian border, and they wouldn't let us without a mask and vaccination. It was really weird. I was one of the few people actually vaccinated in the country at the time. So I was like, well, I'm immune to this thing kind of. So I guess I'm just observing now. You have pictures of me like wearing a mask up the Empire State Building and the Freedom Tower and stuff. It's just a weird period.
It is.
And so going back to the Fallen 13, Afghanistan is just really quickly deteriorating. And I'm like, something is really going to unfold here that we're not going to like. And it just seemed like it was getting more and more out of control. And eventually it did. So I came home in early August from this road trip. And by mid-August, that's when Kabul falls. Then the first images that really started affecting me were seeing the young soccer player, the young 19-year-old soccer player on the national team. People just jumping onto the planes and falling to their death. That really bothered me a lot. That stuck in my mind. Like, my main thought was, I cannot believe this is being allowed to happen the way that it is. I thought that there was a lot more stopgap. 20 years of this and all this money and people have lost their lives there. You think there's more preparation to keep it going, but it fell apart really quick.
You know, Brandon, when all of this started going down, I didn't serve in Afghanistan. I served in Iraq and I served in Africa. but I trained a lot of units for Afghanistan, and when they went over there in the middle of some of the most difficult conflicts, we always lost guys that I trained, and that affected me. So when this whole Afghan pullout started so drastically, and like a repeat of almost like Korea was for us, where the last Americans jumping on the helicopter and people are running up as fast as they can to the top of that building to try to catch the bottom of the helicopter and get on. And I went into a tailspin mentally.
Yeah.
And I reached out to other friends of mine who had served over there, and they were worse. It really threw people into depression, because then they thought, what did we fight for if it wasn't to allow a democratic ruling in that country, or at least protecting the people who supported us through all of that hardship? And instead, it became an abandonment. And then they said, well, were the deaths for nothing of all my friends, right? Like, it really was such a travesty in our community.
And that affected me as too. I'm like, well, if this is the way Afghanistan is going to go, what did people like Marcus serve for? He gave up his life at a very young age, and I'm thinking about, well, he was planning to be a sheriff's deputy, go to college, have more of an active life. He never got the chance to do that. And a lot of people I know didn't either.
Right.
I'm just like, I can't believe they're just letting it go and just letting it fall apart so easily like that. It was just unfathomable.
It is.
It's like you were on a train and then somebody hit the brakes on the train, like as a freight train crashing and derailing. It just seemed like that type of situation or feeling. And so that just bothered me to no end. I'm like, I can't believe that's how it was happening. Then the palace was taken over, the presidential palace was taken over by the Taliban. The president fled. I'm just like, I can't believe how easily they just gave up like that. And then I figured from there, the situation was just going to get worse. And then,
I had a friend who was a logistics guy on the ground at the end, and he had what they call a hand receipt for all of the equipment, and he was told to just leave it. And everything was left, all of the equipment, all of our technology, all of our communication, like it was just left for the enemy to take it and learn how to use it.
100%. And then the thing is, being someone that's traveled in and out of our area, I'm like, they were starting to talk about sending emergency forces over for the evacuation, Army, Marines. And I'm like, well, if they call Marines, there's only 2 major bases in the United States for Marines. It's in South Carolina and California.
Right.
And if they call people, it's going to be people either from our local area, like one of my cousins were, or people they knew, people that travel in our area, train in our area. And that's going to be who's called up.
Yep.
For that type of evacuation. And I'm like, my gut was like, that's not going to end well. So I actually started quietly preparing myself. There's probably going to be casualties of some sort, even at least injuries. And so I was just reading today, actually, they were announcing there was probably going to be a suicide bomber attempt on that airport 10 days before the attack, because the Taliban were releasing people and the ISIS members were getting out and they're planning revenge. And I'm like, that airport to me was wide open for an attack. And eventually I'm like, if there's an attack and there's fatalities, it's going to be people from our area, probably our county, at least people that have passed through our county and our part of California. I'm like, I'm going to have to be prepared for it. And as days went by, it's like they're ignoring it. I'm like thinking to myself, how are civilians here in the U.S., 7,000 miles away, more concerned, it seemed like, about this than those who are in charge of the situation on the ground or in Washington? It just it didn't seem like there was much interest in it.
I agree.
And then eventually I was awake on the 26th of August. I was online and I happened to wake up at like 4:00 in the morning, I think, because I was getting up early from traveling. And then I hear the first, and then I was watching some of it live because the BBC was live and stuff early in the morning. I could live stream it. And then boom, 5 a.m. or so our time, 5:30 or 6 a.m. our time, IED goes off. Like, great. I was just like, it was surreal. I'm like, I cannot believe what we were warned about for the last week and a half has literally been allowed to happen. And it happened. And that was pretty stunning. And you were hearing American casualties. You were seeing videos of smoke in Kabul. The reporters were on one hill overlooking the airport. You were seeing like different journalists from different countries see it. And I'm just like, I turned the internet off and I went off media. I'm like, well, in the next several days, we're most likely going to be hearing about people from our region. And a couple of days later, Hunter Lopez was the first one, and he lives about 50 miles away from me. Family's part of the county sheriff's department here. I'm like, not remotely surprised, just because I expected, it just seemed like it was not inevitable, but being poorly handled. And then it became even more surreal when we started learning 3 people from our area. We're from an area called the Inland Empire, inland Southern California, areas east of LA, Orange County. It just absolutely blew my mind that 3 people were from our region. And then we allowed people that were children or babies or weren't born during 9/11 to end their lives like this. And it's like, how for 20 years did we let that situation get so out of control and just forgotten? And this is the epitome of it. But then there was a bright spot to it. When that happened, and the days and weeks after, between the time the attack happened and the return for burial in the United States, I had never seen, this is the first time I think I had seen since the day after 9/11. If you remember September 12th, everybody talks about it. This was like, I think, the first time, and since then, I had seen the country come together in such like a unified way. And we were so divided during the pandemic and the presidential elections and stuff. And it was really like a rare return to that moment where the whole country was like unified behind these 13. And you would see like people putting out 13 glasses, 13 beers, 13 plates, everywhere had it. The supermarket down the street from me for months, like 6 months after, had 13 flags in their shopping area because it was that impactful. It was local people, and people were just so stunned that we allowed people so young, kids really, to get killed like that. And it really caused a major reflection. And over time, I started visiting the cemetery where Marcus was buried because I'd never been there. I used to think he was in LA, but he was actually in our region. And I came across, one of the first things I experienced was I was taking photos of it because I'd never seen it before. It was Day of the Dead too. So I'm like, I can take a few photos just to see how they decorate. And I was actually, this was about, Day of the Dead's the 31st. So about, I'd say a month and a half after Kareem Nakui was buried. I went to the procession for Kareem Nakui being brought home. So when he came into the airport, I was by it as it went in the town. Same with Hunter Lopez. They came through our area. He's actually buried pretty close to where I used to live. Didn't for Dylan Mural, but I watched it live. And it just, he was buried and he grew up so close to one of the schools I grew up. So going back to when I was teaching virtually, is like when Kareem Nakui in particular died, it felt like I had lost a student of my own. And it was like, they're in the same age, like it could have easily been someone I was their teacher at high school or someone that age that I was in. It was horrible. And I had seen some students die in like car accidents or illness before, but this was just like another level.
Yeah.
And it felt like, I felt like we as a country had really let them down. And it was really polarizing me that I felt like I should do a lot more for the military community than I had been before. And using the tools and the experience I had teaching, I felt like in the visual arts, that's something I felt like I needed to make a priority. And a few other experiences. The first time I went to go see Kareem Nakui, I didn't know where he was buried. I thought, I was walking around. I'm like, oh, he must not have a marked grave yet because it's only been a couple weeks. And found Marcus. It took forever, but I found Marcus on a hill. And when I was walking around the cemetery I'd never been to, there was a car full of people, and they had specific haircuts, shortcuts. It's an older car. The way they were dressed was kind of like beach attire. And I kind of knew from my cousin being a Marine, I'm like, I bet those are Marines or people in the military. It's a coincidence. And they were really intensely looking for something. They were driving around like they couldn't find it. Like, this was clearly their first time here. I didn't know who it was. And then I went over to a hedge area. I'm like, oh, this must be where Kareem is buried. I'll just take a picture of it. I'll come back when the headstone is here in a couple months. And then I see one of them get out of the car, a couple of them. They go over to a hedge area. It goes like this. And he's pointing to the other 2 people. I'm like, what in the world? I'm like, they are Marines. And they found Kareem. I go to the hedge area. It's Kareem Nakui's headstone. And I took a book of them from a distance, kind of just sitting there. And I later got to know them and Shanna, his mom, and some other people over time, just visiting the cemetery or seeing them in the community. And I found out, there were a lot of rumors and stuff going around too. I found out that actually was the first time they had actually visited Kareem since the bombing. And I had actually just stumbled upon the moment they had come there and photographed it. Didn't know I had at the time. I was just sitting there because of the traffic. I'm like, I don't want to drive home yet. I just sat there and took a photo or two. And it just blew my mind. And the reason they hadn't gone there, because some of them had been injured actually in the explosion. Many people don't realize there was also a firefight right after, immediately after the detonation. And that's still being investigated even this week. And you really just find out the horrific circumstances. Some of it they would talk about, parents would talk about, members of the community would talk about when you were there. And you would just hear things. And then you would hear about, like, it seemed like they were really traumatized with the experience, angry at the government. And I started going to different events. Like eventually we had the 21st birthday for Dylan Mural, who's another individual, another Marine that was killed in it. I met Cheryl, his mom, a number of other Marines, and I really got to see a lot heavier, a lot of depression, anxiety, PTSD, some of the physical injuries from the bombing. It was just 100% devastating. And you could see that the military and the government had not really done as much as it could have to look after the mental and physical health. And you were hearing some of the stories, and it was just horrific. And as time went by, this was April 2022, I got to know them a bit better, became more friendly with the families. I'd hear a lot more about the stories, went to more public events, like there was a post office dedication. And I eventually got to meet an Army soldier of mine in the 82nd Airborne that did not go to Afghanistan, but could have. And you started, at this time, this was early 2023 now, you started hearing, so all these things like painting murals, teaching around where the Marines are, getting more knowledge started coming together in a meaningful way. I also got a commission. The city of Ontario, where Victor Glover's from, did a public utility box mural painting program. So I submitted, I'll do Victor Glover, because I wanted to see, I almost went to Artemis 1, which was I did go to Artemis 1, to see the launch of the first rocket, first lunar mission from the United States in 50 years. I wanted to be there for the moment. So I was there in August 2022. And I wanted to see that moment and be part of it. It got scrubbed twice, so I just went home from Florida. It was literally like the week after the first anniversary of the Kabul airport attack. So this all kind of got my mind swirling. Well, you know what, Victor? I found out they had announced when I was teaching. They announced the crew of Artemis 2, which was it's going to be the first manned crew to go back to the moon in 50 years. And Victor Glover was actually from our region. I'm like, oh, that's exciting. So I decided, he's an Iraq War veteran, so I decided to paint him. So I did one utility box for him and got permission. And that really kind of got me thinking, I've been thinking about doing art projects related to veterans for a really long time. We see them around us. There's some pieces in our region that can do it. Why don't I do one of my own? So I started about that. And there's a VFW in our town. And I'm like, well, maybe they'll let me approach them and do it. So Halloween 2023, I went and gave them a letter, and I'm asking, is this something that I can do? If we can fundraise for this, can we do it? And they had a meeting with their board of trustees to say, yeah, why not? Let's do it. And I'm like, it's really a spectacular location. We had done a couple murals at this point. We did one, the college one I mentioned. I did one of my own. And then we came together as a team and did a mural on a frame shop. And it was just a postcard of our town. It's on one of the main thoroughfares. You see a lot of homeless vets there. You see the Air Force flying over a lot. And one of the scenes depicts, some of the towns that we used to have that became our city in the 40s and 50s. They were military communities. And there's one of the artists in one of the frames, it's picture frames and mirrors as part of the subject matter. One of the things he did was one of the air shows. It's really this cool, bright color that he did. His name is Patrick Barwinski, and he did a few murals like that. So like there's a lot of potential in this. It just really blew my mind. We really could do something meaningful with it. So I got permission from the VFW to start doing it. And I'm like, well, as we're doing this, we're having a lot of students from the school district come, and they're seeing it. They're reading about us in the college magazine, community college. The students are like getting videos of it. And so like the kids in the school district are like, well, we can do this too. Oh, and there actually is an enthusiasm for these type of projects. And they really wanted to get involved in it and bring it with them, which I thought was great. I'm like, this is something I'm going to individually. So I'm like, I'm going to become a mural painter myself on the side. And I'm like, outside of teaching, I'm going to do it. Or whatever job I have, I'm going to do it. So I got permission for the VFW one. And we started going back and forth on different designs. I was actually going to do a mural on another community center in the city, but we had some issues getting that going. And the building was kind of old, and there were some other safety issues that we didn't agree on. So it was actually going to be about March Field, and it was going to be about air crews from World War II in the Korean War era. So it had a B-29 in it, and you had women that were in the WASP program, and you had different people that were crew members or pilots. I'm like, that's something I want to celebrate, because it was next to the state park, the community center. I'm like, this would be something as an educational tool that will help the veterans. There's veterans housing there. It's a really pretty sadly downtrodden park. It's really an abandoned part of March Air Force Base. I'm going through some of these places. I'm like, this looks like something out of Stranger Things in the underground.
Yeah.
It's really funny because it's over Air Force infrastructure. You see these old vehicles and stuff there. I'm like, if we do a mural here, it'll be really beneficial, not only for the veterans. And right across from that park, there's a lot of officers that live there in the Air Force, and their kids come in and out of that park. I'm like, that would be a benefit for those kids that see it. Community center, the skate park. And one of the things I always wanted to kind of advocate for was more equity for the people considering careers in the military, because most of those enlisted are male Caucasian. You only have like 17% that are not. And the Marines are actually the highest at 17% with like non-Caucasian enlisted personnel. I'm like, well, if we do people of different skin tones or cultural backgrounds, and if this mural will encourage people to consider those careers more. Because where I'm from, when I grew up, like I said, we didn't have much to do. It was even more less when my grandparents were growing up here. It was just, you had to go out to LA and get things to do things. There was nothing here at all. And like, this will cause kids not only get involved in the arts, but want to enjoy them, consider careers in the military, imagine themselves in those careers. And it was really pretty cool about that. So fortunately, that mural didn't work out. We didn't get to do that one. So then I started recycling the design. Well, I started talking to the VFW. I'm like, can we do something related to the Korean War or World War II? They're like, they didn't want that. They wanted something more contemporary, because most of their patronage is people from the Gulf War or later. I'm like, okay. So we decided to do that. And I went through a number of different designs. I was actually going to use silhouettes of people like Dylan Marola and others that were killed in Kabul, sort of like an Easter egg. It was going to be sort of just black silhouettes against the sunrise, and you have black imagery in it. But I'm like, that might be a little too specific. And then I also started thinking, we've lost a lot of people that were not in Kabul during the withdrawal. So many people over the years in all branches. And we started talking about that a little. I'm like, I kind of wanted to do something to reflect on all of them, and also those who were in Kabul, because this VFW is only about a mile or less than a mile north of the March Gate. And the last facility that 12 of the 13 that were killed, and many that went with them to go to Jordan and Afghanistan, was that base. I mean, it's the largest logistics hub on the West Coast. The military, so they went from Pendleton to there, and then they flew there. And I'm like, I found out from Kareem Nakui's mom, she posted about it on Instagram one day. I'm like, I cannot believe that actually is literally one of the last places they were when they were alive on U.S. soil. And that's like the last memories they have of Southern California before they flew away. And so that just blew my mind. I felt like we really needed to do something in honor, not only of them, but a lot of generations. So we decided on that. And it was more personal as well. I'll plug some other people. My cousin that was in the Air Force, he had a friend that was in the Army for many years too. He was an Iraq and Afghanistan veteran too. He ended up getting married, moving away to Washington State. April 2023, I find out over Mother's Day he committed suicide. And this is about just over a year and a half since the pull out of Kabul. And I think some of it was a factor. I look back now, I'm thinking, what happened didn't affect just those that were there and that younger generation. It was everybody. And that moral injury they're discussing is across the board. So as I was learning that and planning to do a mural, I'm kind of thinking, it should be something about all generations of vets from the war and every theater. The global war on terror was around the world. It was in Syria, it was in Africa, it was in the Philippines, it was in Europe. Yeah. It didn't really matter who you were and what you did. And so I decided an Army infantry soldier. They also kind of wanted to be action-packed. I'm like, this would be pretty cool for the kids to come up and take photos with. Like, we should do that. And I I started, okay, so we had tanks in it, we had some aircraft, but as I'm painting it, a lot of the vets are also vets of the global war on terror, and I met people like helicopter pilots and captains and people that are injured. They're having a hard time getting things from the VA. I go in there and I use the restroom, I sit down and just take a break for a little while, and you just have a lot of conversations, and a lot of the vets are just extremely grateful that you're doing it for them. And they talk about it, word gets around. It's really positive for them because they feel like they're forgotten. It's like, it didn't really matter what age or generation. It's like, they're like, no one cares about us. The only other place we can get together with vets is here, or a place like it. And it's like, they are so grateful and appreciative that someone at all took the time to do it. And my friend Angel, I was mentioning, I hadn't talked to him for a while. He was running for public office. He didn't win the election, but he was running for public office in October 2021. And he's a veteran of Afghanistan. And I went to one of his meetings during that time, and he was bringing up ideas like, what should we do for the visual arts in the community if I get elected? We talked about it, and he was telling me he helped actually I found out about a month and a half after Kabul fell, or so, 2 months, that he had actually gotten an interpreter out.
Cool.
You were one of the that did. He was working with one of his friends that's now in the U.S. in Ohio to get someone out. They got him out, but here's the thing. I can't mention his name.
Yep.
Because he left Afghanistan, he escaped, but made it to Turkey,
But his
but got
family
deported
didn't.
back to Turkey. And he's still in Afghanistan as of right now. Oh, yeah. There's a province that's controlled by the resistance or something like that, or some of the areas, and he's still there. So when people talk about Americans still being their Afghan allies, it's 100% true.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was interesting that he got deported not only from a NATO ally, but how we have just not failed to get a lot of the people out that should be out of that situation. And it's like, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So I was painting Mural, decided to do it as a black and white piece because I had just come home from Europe, and I'm like, there's a lot of cool ones that are just black and white. And I had seen some in like the Imperial War Museum in Vienna, Paris, and some other ones. I'm like, a lot of simple, cool artwork of World War II just done in black, white line. So okay, I'll do that. So it was a lot cheaper, easier to get the material. And Angel was so awesome. Him and another friend of mine is an architect out here regionally. His name is Jerry Ricardo. Helped fundraise, give me the supplies for it. And we started working together and put it together. And so over the course of between January and April 2024, I started painting it. It could have been done faster, but it was raining a lot, a pretty heavy rain season this year. And you just start working on it and putting together and going through it. You know, people in the neighborhood stop by and see it. A lot of Air Force people come and go and see it. And then I would have veterans ask me, well, how come they're not doing something for the Navy or the Coast Guard or another branch? Or like, they're kind of dropping hints. So like, they loved my project, but they wanted something that represented them too. I'm like, okay. So I started throwing in like new aircraft, like the Ospreys in there now. You have a C-130, you know, and they can represent different branches. So I'm like, it's more cross branch than just the Marines, the Army.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I was proud to complete it and finally get it underway in April. And ever since then, I talk about it every time I do a teaching interview. I've created worksheets and activities for young people in our community to do it in the school district. And I really think that it gave a boost to like young people in our community and the area around us to be interested in painting. And I'm really hoping, one of my main goals is near March Air Force Base and other places like San Bernardino, where Norton used to be. It was like, to see a renaissance, you know, let's paint and let's remember some of these old military facilities that we don't have anymore. And we can bring back, undo some of the urban blight that's happened in the years since they closed.
Yeah.
And one of the things about the 13 or two of the 13 from our region that were killed was Kareem Nakui was really into photography. And his mom and other people and then the press talked a lot about how he was sending videos home of what they were seeing in Afghanistan. And you see a lot of videos of him like talking to children that were there, or when he was traveling to Jordan before the end of the war. He just loved documenting where he was. And that always, and to me, I'm like, where did he get that? And I came across his Instagram, and when he was in high school, he would do a lot of digital painting. And he really was into the Marines because he was painting a lot of Marines deployed places in the desert. He got into that, I think, because of his high school classes. And then as you do other things, you learn that like Dylan Mural was a theater kid. He was a theater tech at his high school in Rancho Cucamonga. He went to Los Osos High School. And I loved hearing about that. I got to see his theater teacher speak at a few events. And he was really into like lighting and set design and making things organized. And you don't really expect that of someone that necessarily goes into the Marine Corps, but that was some of the things he had a huge passion for.
Yeah.
And
those are some of the things I encourage veterans today to participate with their hobbies as part of a healing journey and a wellness journey for them. And Brandon, we've only got another 2 minutes left here in this interview, but I really want to ask your opinion on something. And as we talk to this group who's going to be watching this video and learning all of this history that you've shared with us and these personal examples, which have been so powerful, what advice can you give from your perspective for someone who's healing from mental, physical trauma?
I really think that people need to try some of the things that we do. I've done, in honoring the 13 and other veterans, painting, I've seen there's so many avenues open to people to deal with their mental health and their stress, no matter what it is. And some of it is like photography. Some of it is painting. Some of it's volunteering and fundraising for projects like this to be done. I've seen so many vets become teachers or go work with the youth in their community, and it's just so healing for them. And being out and active and hiking with people or working at, a community center or something and giving back in that way has been absolutely benefiting, telling their story to people. One of the things I'm so proud of a lot of the vets at the withdrawal is that they're going out on YouTube and stuff and actually telling what happened, because most of the public doesn't know a lot of what occurred.
True.
Just making a video and editing a video and talking to people, or going to your library, or going to do into a classroom. And I'd be happy to have any vet, once I have a classroom again of my own, to have any vet talk about that, talk about their experiences and what they can do in whatever class it is. It could be visual art. We talk a lot about analyzing murals, and we have in the social studies world, we have DBQs, which is document-based questions, where you look at political cartoons and testimony from the time. There's so many avenues that veterans and people working with their mental health can teach through, whether it's the school system, the public, just finding a workshop at your local library, going online and finding an avenue. There's an organization, one of the nonprofits set up after the withdrawal, that's recording all of the testimony of vets from the withdrawal, and they're putting it on Spotify. That is really powerful to me, and I see it on YouTube more now. There's so many avenues and abilities for people to do things, not only for their mental health, but, in honor and memory of people that they served with or people that passed. I talk about Dylan or Kareem. They had other friends like Dagan Page that were in photography. And these are all things and stories I've learned about from meeting them and going to events in public. One of the ways they can honor them and their legacy is by keeping these types of educational opportunities alive for youth. Going into the classroom, volunteering, fundraising for that mural, that theater program, working with veterans. I've seen organizations go on bases and they work with veterans to make sculptures and paint murals with them or their families or that community. There's so many opportunities to just give back, and you're living their legacy and keeping their memory alive through the actions that you do with veterans in any community. And that is something anyone can do. You don't have to be a teacher to do that. You don't even have to be enlisted to have done that. Anybody can give back and donate or do something like that. Yeah. And that, I think, is one of the simplest pieces of advice. Anyone can do that. You just think about the kids that were in the withdrawal. They're taking video and they're documenting history and folding them all around them. They don't even know what their next 5 minutes are going to be. But with that, now countless generations are going to know what happened, the madness of that time, and a lot of the warm stories too, and keeping their memory and legacy alive is a lot what I keep going, and one of the things I see is apathy a lot. And I'm like, the adults here don't care. But then I go around, and whenever I need to be reminded about to be motivated or to get something done for the community, I go to the skate park, I go to the mall, I go to the library, I go places where there are young people, even from a distance. And I remember being that kid, being bored, having nothing to do, wishing they had public art, wishing they could do more. And I really promise you, a lot of people that are enlisted, they enlist so they can get away from whatever circumstance they're in. They leave small towns, they leave bad homes, and they travel taking pictures and video to get out and try to have opportunities they didn't get when they grew up.
Yep.
And a lot of them are young people when they realize it, even as adults. And I'm like, whenever I need reminding, I go, this is not for me. It is for future generations, because I'm trying to change things that they can have, things that I didn't have growing up. They have educational programs, they have art, they have access to that. They have a safe community in a neighborhood that's not blighted and full of drugs and homeless. I tell you, painting this VFW mural, we saw a lot of that. The homeless vets were taken care of. There are some pretty dangerous situations even there. And, it's a lot of stuff I have to give politicians advice on. You make sure that the neighborhoods are safe before you go take a photo with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to deal with some of that, and it's like anyone can make that difference and make that leap. And I encourage anyone to do it. You don't have to be educated or like me, an educator, to do it.
Yeah. Brandon, you've been an all-star, and I appreciate you sharing so many stories and examples with us, things that I haven't even heard in greater detail. And this has been incredible, and I encourage everyone to have taken notes. And if you've been inspired by what Brandon's been able to share with us today, please, in your community, reach out to him. I'll put his contact information, his Instagram account at the bottom here in the description. I'll try to include some of the photos that he's got for the events that he's held, and also the remembering of the Fallen 13. And please feel free to reach out to him if you'd like. Look at his stuff, subscribe to his channel, find that inspiration, and go out and make a change in your communities too. And again, Brandon, thanks very much for being on this channel today and sharing with our audience your views, your testimony of veterans' history.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and giving me a platform to do it. I greatly appreciate it.